Ding, dong, dong. We are live. We are starting. I am Jean-Michel. All the speakers are there. Paul and Michael for the presentation. Lucia and Chloe for the discussion. Let's go. And I will start with some slides which are coming. They are coming, but not soon because I forgot to do what I was asked to do, which is to share. I restart, share. As you can see, I'm lost. That's life. Desktop. Glachant.
Do you want me to share the slides, Jean-Michel?
Okay, to me. If you have it, do it. Okay, so we are starting. It's about the new handbook we edited, Paul, Michael, and I, about electricity regulation. We assume it will be printed in June. We will see. Next. In fact, it is our second handbook. The first one, it was on electricity market, second edition in 2023. This new one is about regulation, printed, we assume, in June. By accident, they have both 20 chapters, around 600 pages. Good luck to read it a full weekend. And another accident, both 37 authors. Waf, waf, that's life. More interesting, both are centered on advanced experiences, latest tech trends. It is why we have more, you have more on the Western world. But we know perfectly that the Western world is not anymore granting to be extremely advanced. I've been told that a country under Canada, you know the country under Canada? This country is trying to go backward. It happens. That's why we also address China. And remember that China is #1 in the world for manufacturing on green tech. We also address the other developing countries. And in this second handbook, we are looking at India. India is something all of you have to look at. And I assume that you know that next year, 2026, they will manufacture our iPhones. Next. This second handbook has triangles together. It makes it really an handbook. We are addressing the old classical cost of service regulation. We have 100 countries still using it, and some states in the US. We are also addressing the old novel incentive regulation invented in UK, but Paul was also a pioneer creating incentive regulation. And we also look at advanced experiences and tech trends to reach net zero. We know that net zero is a new type of goal, totally new. We know that net zero is foreign to ordinary markets, foreign to existing companies, also foreign to existing bodies of regulation. That's why we want to look at it, because it is a challenge for humanity. To reach this net zero someday. Next. Here you will suffer, Tomiris, because each chapter is separated from the others. Go. Go. First chapter, introduction, we don't care. Second chapter, designing incentive regulation. Brown and Sappington, you know Sappington already, both of Canada, a fantastic chapter. Then cost of service in US by Paul and his friend Richard at MIT. Then the fourth chapter, The distribution already facing the future in Great Britain by Claudia. Then the fifth, distribution already facing the future in European Union, Christine from the Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure, and I. Six, we are back to US for regulation of transmission with two very interesting consultants, Joe De Loza and Johannes Pfeifenberger, with the help of Paul. Seven, regulation of transmission in GB by Paul Newberry, not the worst chapter of the book. Regulation of transmission in EU by three young, very dynamic consultants, Paul, Otto, and Joost. 9, regulation of networks in Australia. You remember that Australia is bigger in size as a territory than the entire Europe. And the chapter is made by Paul. Paul is a former academic and today is CEO of a company. Really a chapter not to be missed. Then retail design. Retail design is key for flexibility of consumption. In the US, it can be addressed by regulated tariffs, time varying regulated tariff. And in other countries, differently, but still time varying. And Ahmad Farouki is really the pop of time varying in consultancy, and he is helped by a younger colleague, Ziyi Tang. Now, part 2. Energy efficiency. A very good chapter from Kenneth and Erika, both American researchers. Part 2. Part 2, regulatory mechanism for the transition. The part 2 is entirely addressing transition. First chapter, the 12th, the grid of the future by two engineers. They explain us how the grid is transforming. It is something we have to know, even if we are only economists or other type of regulator. And Janusz is a very, very well-known engineer, not originally from UK, but working in UK. 13th, decarbonizing US grid, federal versus state framework by Judy Chang and Ari Lee. And between you and me, Judy is become regulator now. So she is applying or trying to apply what she tells in this chapter. Now, EU distribution to achieve net zero, the flex issue. Tim Schittekate is formerly from MIT and France School, and today a consultant in UK. 15, behind the meter. The book is on electricity regulation. A big part of the new electricity system is not regulated, but interacting a lot with regulation. It's a chapter by a master of this, Feridoun from California. 16, net zero, uncertainty, uncertainty, and uncertainty by Michael and two of his friends. 17, network companies to promote innovation in the EU. Leo and Nicolo, both from France School. Leo is even the new boss at France School. 18, regulation of hydrogen networks and hydrogen market. That's the coming big thing in energy by Cambridge guys, Chikong and Jackson. 19, EV adoption. Maybe you remember that some time ago, US was a very progressive nation pushing for EV adoption. It is remembered at MIT, Chris Neatle is the boss of the laboratory, already directed by Paul, and Shinsuke Kanaka is working with him. And the part 3, only 3 chapters, but really key, because you have China. What do they do in China? And do they do it for economic logic or political reasoning? And Shu Yishong is really an experienced prof from Australia, but originally Chinese. Second, India, transmission, distribution, retail, by Anupama and Touraj. And Touraj is a former friend of Michael at Cambridge, and today the boss of the Copenhagen School of Energy Infrastructure. End-to-end, Deba, Brata, and Vivienne. Vivienne is today, if I remember correct, at Imperial College, but a very well-known researcher for developing countries. That's the handbook. That's the weekend you will spend reading it. Next. Coming events. Next. The event you are attending already. Next. Next. You are too fast, Tomiris. Next. At Front School, the same online, you will get European Union that we do not really address today, or just a little bit. The 4th of June, 2 p.m., here at the same Front School, European Union. Next. If you want to see us face to face, we are offering it to you. We will address US, UK, European Union, the rest of the world. When? Tuesday, 17th of June, 9 a.m. in Paris. You will get Josco Polyglacian, like today. You will get the discussant Lucia and Chloe, and a third discussant you will discover later, plus 2 other speakers, Christine Brandstedt and Tim Schittekate, addressing European Union. It will be at the International Conference in Paris at IAEE. The IAEE, I'm a former boss. And now we are going to close. Keep contact. I'm still on Twitter. If you were Twitter, no problem. I'm still in LinkedIn too. And I have my friend's site web. And to finish, I'm the former president of IAEE. I'm also the former executive vice president at IAEE. I strongly believe into exchanging ideas, exchanging research, exchanging reasoning from Saudi Arabia to South Korea. No country, no block of countries is mastering the future. The future will be created by all of us, including South Africa and Brazil. Thank you. Now we jump on Paul. Paul, you have 20 minutes on US experience and ideas.
Okay, can you see that?
We do.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to cover, well, first of all, good morning or good afternoon, as the case may be. Thank you for coming to hear about this book. As Jean-Michel said, it's a companion to an earlier book on electricity markets. And we decided to do a second one on electricity regulation. Now, a lot of people may think that, well, it's all about markets these days. Why are we going back to regulation? And just looking at these pictures of an electricity grid, both yesterday and today, but also tomorrow, in a decarbonized future, large parts of the grid remain regulated in one way or another. Distribution, transmission, even generation, where there's a market, although not everywhere in the US, but where there is a market, is affected by various regulations, renewable portfolio standards, subsidies, grants, procurement regulations, and so on. So regulation is really very important. And the grid, especially the distribution grid itself, has become more important as electrification takes place, as EV penetration grows, as electric heat pump penetration grows, and as rooftop PV grows, and other local generation. And usually a hit of my presentations is my bill. I no longer present kilowatt hours because they're embarrassingly high. But if you look at my bill, you can see that almost half of the bill is transmission and distribution charges, and those have been growing quickly, and those are regulated. Energy supply is also regulated in the sense that living in Massachusetts, I have obligations to purchase electricity with a growing fraction of the sources being qualified renewable energy. But we're also seeing large increases in distribution and transmission projects and costs. and those are subject to regulation by the states or by the federal government. So the first chapter in this section of the book is really a theoretical chapter or a conceptual chapter that it really looks at the incentives, incentive arrangements that can basically guide firms to take actions that are consistent with public policy. The basic framework here is an incentive regulation or performance-based regulation framework that recognizes that the regulated firms have more information about their costs and their demand and their financing and their managerial effort than the regulator can possibly have. And the idea of incentive regulation is to develop and apply regulatory mechanisms that can provide incentives for the regulated firm to make the best use of its private information in the public interest. And the chapter looks at standard attributes of performance, cost minimization, meeting service quality standards. There are budget balance constraints and incentive compatibility constraints. There are rate design issues. This chapter discusses rate design very briefly, and Ahmad Faruqi's chapter, chapter 10, discusses more innovative rate designs. But this chapter discusses some of the theory of rate design to be consistent with other attributes of regulation. It also looks at stimulating environmental goals. So many of the changes in regulation of distribution by the states are being influenced by providing incentives for firms to pursue environmental goals. There are competition goals. How do we facilitate efficient expansion of distributed energy resources, of distributed storage? And then how do we incent the firms to support achieving environmental objectives? The paper looks at applications, one to rooftop PV, designing regulatory mechanisms to support the expansion of rooftop PV, which actually in Massachusetts, where I'm sitting, given the state's size, has become very important because of the incentives provided. And then applications to advancing environmental goals to get regulated firms to take their carbon footprints and decarbonization goals into account. The next chapter focuses on the empirical details of regulation in the US. And just to remind you, the US has a very heterogeneous electric power sector, also very complex jurisdictional boundaries. So in terms of distribution, this is what's referred to as state jurisdictional. It's the responsibility of the states. There are 49 state public utility commissions and one in the District of Columbia. Nebraska is the only state without a public utility commission because there are no private utilities in that state. There is an energy agency that does oversee what the municipal utilities in the states do. And what's not recognized, there are some aspects of transmission that also continue to be regulated, at least in theory, by the states, and that's covered in the next chapter. There's still very heavy reliance on what I call traditional cost of service regulation and slow expansion of performance-based regulation. The slow expansion of performance-based regulation is very discouraging. I can tell you that the first time I ever testified in favor of a PBR mechanism and time of use pricing was when I was a graduate student in 1971. You can do the arithmetic, that's a long time ago. And my latest graduate student has now gone to the Connecticut Public Utility Commission to pursue some of these ideas. So it's over 50 years. So things don't move so quickly here. The chapter goes through the attributes of how the revenues that are allowed to the regulated firm, what's known as revenue requirements here, are calculated. As I said, it's chapter 10 actually that focuses on rate design. We have some discussion of rate design in this chapter. Data requirements are very important. One way of reducing the asymmetry of information between the regulated firm and the regulator is to provide lots of information on costs, on demand, on other attributes of the corporation. The chapter goes through the determination of the rate base, depreciation, operation and maintenance costs, financing and capital structure, and very importantly, the adjustment mechanisms that are used between regulatory reviews. And lots of the theoretical literature that looks at cost of service regulation assumes that it happens continuously, and that's really not true. There are long periods of time when basically prices are either constant or they're adjusted through external indices, and those indices can provide either good incentives or bad incentives. And we discuss the incentive properties of those, and also have an introduction to the more recent changes in regulation to adopt incentives provisions, in part stimulated by the decarbonization initiatives. Chapter 6 focuses on regulation of access, pricing, and planning of high voltage transmission in the U.S. This is the jurisdictional issues here between the federal government, the states, permitting agencies is extremely complicated. We try in this chapter to unbundle those complications and to try to reduce the confusion. And I can say I've been working on this area for 50 years, and I still learn new things about regulation of transmission. So we try to convey the latest information and how it's changing. One of the reasons for the challenge in understanding transmission regulation is the U.S. industry is still quite heterogeneous. I know people around the world focus on California or Texas or New England, which are liberalized markets and have organized wholesale markets, and they have ISOs. But there are lots of other organizational arrangements. So there are firms and organized markets that are still partially vertically integrated. There are vertically integrated utilities that are outside of organized markets, like the Southern Company or Pacificor, which are two large vertically integrated utilities in the Southeast and the Northwest, respectively, that are where the states are much more important in their regulation and FERC is much less important. And then we have municipal and cooperative utilities, everything from the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which is a large vertically integrated utility, to the town of Belmont, which is many of my colleagues live in, which has a municipal utility that basically just buys power in the wholesale market and distributes it. FERC's role, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's role, has increased over time as markets have been restructured and liberalized. It's moved slowly and but surely in supporting this transition, but the level of activity in this area depends a lot on the leadership and the signals it gets from the administration. And then the final chapter I'll discuss is chapter 13, which focuses on a long list of regulations affecting the decarbonization of the electricity grid. And there are federal and state regulatory frameworks that affect this. And as Jean-Michel noted, Judy Chang is now a commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. This chapter was completed before January 20th, when things may have changed in the US. The chapter looks at federal and state policies that encourage and support decarbonization. The federal policies have been the focus in the international discussions, I think, but the US has no formal legal target for decarbonization. There are goals that were established in the Biden administration that mirror the commitments the US made in the Paris Agreement for 2035 and 2050. There are two primary federal laws that are pushing this forward. The Inflation Reduction Act, this has nothing to do with inflation, which has a large number of subsidies and tax subsidies, direct subsidies, and other financial incentives. And the Biden administration decided that they wanted a system that was not a stick, but was basically based on providing financial incentives. And then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also sometimes referred to as the Bilateral Infrastructure Act, focused very much on supporting the development of transmission, of infrastructure for EVs and other infrastructure support for supporting the transition. It relies primarily on tax subsidies, special investment tax credits, on direct grants, on loans and loan guarantees. And that's been in effect now for 3 years. I would say it's been slow in moving forward, and there's some question as to what will happen in the future. The Biden administration took what they called an all-government approach to decarbonization. That is, decarbonization was a goal that all agencies of government had to take into account. The Office of Management and Budget, which reviews all federal regulations, adopted a higher social cost of carbon, almost $200 a ton, in doing their evaluations. And the Environmental Protection Agency also put out new regulations governing fuel use standards that over time would make it much more attractive to purchase electric vehicles, as well as emission standards for power plants. Those are the federal laws, but states also have decarbonization policy. So 25 states have made net zero commitments, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey. 25 states have parallel binding renewable electricity portfolio standards. That means my electricity supplier has to have a certain fraction of its supply from renewable energy sources that are qualified by the state. And that tightens over time. And then 14 states have adopted the tighter California vehicle emission standards, which pushes the system much more quickly towards decarbonization. State policies include as well state management of procurement. So Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Connecticut have done state managed procurements of wind, of solar, and of Canadian hydro. There are state energy efficiency standards. There are tax and direct subsidies for EVs. And they've created a framework for monetizing, for example, the decarbonization benefits of rooftop PV by creating certifications for renewable energy credits that can be traded and can be used by electricity suppliers to meet their decarbonization commitments. Then I think we've often forgotten there are voluntary corporate end-use decarbonization commitments that rely heavily on long-term PPAs. All the big tech firms have PPAs. Apple, Google, Walmart, Microsoft, MIT has one and is negotiating 2 more PPAs that with wind and solar generators, having adopted voluntary commitments of their own and going out and buying electricity from green energy sources. So a lot of progress has been made so far. Coal plants are retiring quickly. Wind, solar, and batteries accounted for almost all the new generation last year. Offshore wind development has been more challenging, and retail rate design innovations have been slow to move forward. I would just end by saying that all of this is up in the air. We have a new administration that came into power on January 20th. They are not supporters of decarbonization, and they've hinted that they will adopt a number of policies to undermine many of the things that are discussed in this chapter. And I'll turn it back to you, Jean-Michel.
Merci. Sorry, I was speaking French, but merci is the same. Many thanks, Paul. Extremely interesting to have this very comprehensive overview of the US. But I'm not a discussant. We have 2 discussants. Lucia, do you want to be the first and then Chloe?
Okay, Jean-Michel, thank you for the invitation and good afternoon to all of you. And well, I remember a paper in 1994 written by Jean-Jacques Lafont, which was named the New Economics of Regulation 10 years after. Now we are discussing the new regulation, I say 40 years after, because there are 30 years since 1994. And the handbook, in fact, is very rich of insight. But in my discussion, of course, I will concentrate on the chapter that I have received, which is the one by Professor Iosco and Schmalensi. And the chapter traces the evolution of the regulatory approach to the electricity distribution industry, but with a look to the future, from cost of service regulation to new incentive-based mechanism. We all know the shortcoming emerging from the application of cost of service regulation, while performance-based regulation can help modernize the traditional approach, achieving a better alignment with the new decarbonization objective. And in my view, the great message highlighted in the chapter is that performance-based regulation is complementary and not a substitute to the traditional cost recognition mechanism. So the advantage, in my view, is that this allows to modernize incentives without changing entirely the structure. We have different objectives and different instruments. So we solve in this manner a sort of assignment problem. I see two challenges in the application of incentive mechanism. The first one is regulatory complexity, and the second one is related to risk sharing. First, setting correctly KPI and targets is difficult because we have to avoid conflicting rule and incentives, and it is difficult to design and check the performance metrics because we need observable and verifiable results in an environment that is full of uncertainty. And second, as we move to incentive mechanism, risk sharing becomes a relevant issue because we have to allow firms to bear some risk, and this can be inappropriate when investment in new technology for decarbonization is riskier if compared to investment, for example, in conventional technology. So the regulators has to find a way and design a complex but effective schemes that balances cost recovery with incentives. And
we should ask Paul to comment or to answer now. Paul, would you answer, comment, react?
Okay, Lucia, thank you. I think that was a very insightful comment. I'm, of course, quite familiar with the Lafont and Tirol's work. I taught it with Jean Tirole when he was at MIT for 8 years. And I think you picked up on a very, very important point that cost of service regulation is a complement to incentive regulation, that you're sort of hanging these incentive features onto that core principle because that's the core mechanism that almost all incentive regulation programs go back to basically make sure prices aren't too high or too low, or quality's not too high or too low. You have a way of getting back. And this is actually discussed in the introduction to Lafont and Tirole, their 1994 book, where they basically say they're complementary. So I very much appreciate that. And I'll just note, I have a longer paper on incentive regulation in the US that was published, I guess, last year in the
I have read it.
Industrial Organization Review.
I got it.
Okay, good. So I think it's an important subject, but I think it is discouraging how slow it's been to roll out in the US.
Well, I have another comment, if I can.
Please do.
Because I think that there is a ghost flying over the world of regulation of electricity distribution, because now we don't have captive customers anymore, but customers can choose to leave. And I believe that grid defection is a game changer. So I would like to have Professor Yosko to comment about this, because I know it is a reality in most countries. And there is evidence that in the US, there are regions in which grid defection is viable. How we can deal with this problem, that the grid may become a picker service, and maintaining a grid for occasional use maybe is expensive and inefficient. We can have more risk for reliability. So I think that this should change the way in which regulators act, and also utilities have to adapt to this new reality. So I would like to have the comment of Professor Yosko about this.
Well, I think, again, that's a good observation. I don't feel I'm independent of my distribution company yet. Quite the opposite. And they, of course, are going to provide the electricity for an EV and the electricity for a electric heat pump. But I can also now put on a rooftop solar. I think you see this most significantly with very large customers that are coming into the market, data centers, which are increasingly looking to basically build their own power plants or to own their own power plants to serve them. So I think this is the kind of thing one has to build into an incentive regulation program where, to the extent you believe this competition is beneficial, you don't want the utility to be in a position where they feel that they have to discourage it. You want them to encourage it. And on the other hand, if the competition is resulting because of regulatory imperfections, then I think you've got to try to get rid of those imperfections. But certainly the space is changing quite significantly, and I'm seeing it much more now as the whole question of data centers and how they should be integrated into the system is being addressed.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks to both of you. Thank you, Lucia. Chloe,
Yes.
how
Hi,
do you
everyone.
see it?
Yeah. Thank you for the invite. Paul, thank you for a really nice overview. So I have to admit, I don't know well the US market fully, but actually I have 3 points or more questions that I would like you to react on. Because I think, so my first question is about the time frame. So, you know, exactly what you say is like, okay, now we're going to we're not all of us have passive consumer. I am still passive consumer, but some of us are also prosumer, right? So do you see that now we have to change the regulation? And even if we talk about incentive regulation, maybe if we want incentive regulation or incentive or flexibility at the short term, maybe we do not want the same regulation if we think much more long term in terms of investment. So that will be my first comment, or I just want to hear your reaction. The second point is, I was wondering, so, and you mentioned during your overview, is about technology and uncertainties. So let's take the hydrogen. There's been a hype in hydrogen. People are investing, deciding to invest, some deciding not to invest. So there are a lot of uncertainty in the market concerning the technology. So I was wondering if incentive regulation can take into account this uncertainty, and how, if, or is it we need still to have some backup, or I don't know. I would like to have your reaction on these uncertainties related to technology. And my third point, you just touched about this, but I think it's important. Do we always need regulation in the sense that, let me take exactly the example of data centers that are buying a nuclear power plant or have a special agreement. So, and this is really bilateral agreement. And then again, my question is like, okay, here, do we need incentive regulation? Do we have it, or should we have it, or should we not care, or how it's going to work when you have private actors, really important private actors that are.
We got your point, Chloe. You are disconnected, but we got your point. Paul, you have 3 points.
Buying those assets and
how do you react?
Special agreement. So 3 points,
well,
right?
Why don't I? Obviously, uncertainty. We really live in a world with a lot of uncertainty. I think the basic framework for incentive regulation, given the uncertainty, is to make sure that the incentives will accommodate consumers turning to these alternatives without penalizing the incumbent utility. Because if you're going to penalize them, they're going to do everything they can to make it impossible. And let me tell you, given what's going on with data centers, that everybody wants a piece of the regulation. There are lots of ways of discouraging them. But if you take the basic principle that these are large customers, they ought to be able to negotiate their own contracts. So we're not going to get involved in that. We do have to look at whether they're free riding on, for example, on the reliability of the system, and how to go out and make sure that they're paying for increased reliability if that's necessary. I mean, some of these data centers are 1,000 megawatts, so that if you suddenly drop offline, that has some implications. So these are the things one has to really think through, that you want to be accepting of these opportunities. And data centers is just one example, but also there are microgrids that may be significant economic alternatives to the larger networks. There may be opportunities for energy efficiency activities and so on. And I think what stimulated a renewal of interest in regulatory reform, and in particular incentives and performance, is that these options are now becoming visible, especially in those states that are promoting decarbonization. And they're slowly reforming the regulatory process to recognize this, to try to make it so that the customer can make the right economic trade-offs consistent with the goals of the Commission. So I think that's a very good question. And in terms of uncertainty, the people were slow to look at the implications of data centers. And now they're looking very, very quickly at them. And they're not the traditional large load in the sense they don't have a lot of employees once they're finished, but they do pay state property taxes and state income taxes, so that there's an interest in accommodating these. On the other hand, there's a concern that they will cause reliability problems, or they'll cause prices to go up too quickly, and so on. And those are all part of the discussion and something they're trying to bring into the regulatory principles. Thank you for those comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. We might come back in the general discussion. People in the audience, you might ask questions in the Q&A box. For the moment, I have only one from Aduri Naxim. And now we jump on Michael, sorry. Michael was supposed to address only UK, but he has been very brave. He's addressing UK and the rest of the world. Michael, 20 minutes.
Okay, can you hear me all right? I hope so. So thank you. I should say what a pleasure it's been to work again with Jean-Michel and Paul on this book, and I should give a big thanks to all of our authors who actually wrote these chapters, which I'm going to summarize, and I'm going to summarize all the chapters I've realized that are not on the US. I'm not quite all of them, but all the ones that I was responsible for. So I will start by talking about the chapter that we have on the UK distribution system. This is by Claude Jenkins, who used to work at Ofgem. She has written a really nice chapter sort of summarizing Ofgem's experience, talking about the system of regulation that we've developed in Great Britain, and emphasizing, I think, one of the things that we wanted to do in writing the book, which is bring out lessons for other countries which perhaps haven't got as sophisticated systems of regulation as they could have. So she talks about things that Ofgem has developed, like a wider range of outputs that are being incentivized under incentive regulation, such as allowing TOTEX regulation, where the regulation of the sum of operating plus capital costs is considered, which allows companies to move away from asset-heavy solutions.
Could you look at your slide, Michael? It is not full screen.
It is on mine.
Ah.
Shall I? I can try share it again. It is when I do it. Oh, I see. Want to try that? Is that full screen?
Wow.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Great. Thanks. Thanks, Jean-Michel. So I was just mentioning TOTEX expenditure regulation. The other thing that's discussed in here, which I think is worth other countries learning, is about automatic adjustment mechanisms and reopeners, which again is something that's covered in the chapter really nicely. We also then have a chapter by David Newbury, which is on transmission regulation in Great Britain. This is something which is very much debated at the moment, but David discusses some of the issues that the UK has been grappling with, in particular, trying to send signals via transmission charges, either via transmission charges on where to connect generation. Obviously, within different jurisdictions, there tends to be places in the network which are cheaper to serve a connection from, and places which are more expensive. GB has got a system of cost reflective connection charging, which encourages generators to connect where in places where there is transmission capacity available, encourages demand to connect in places where there's supply available. But that's rather clunky, where David discusses also the debate that we're having on complementing that with zonal pricing, and introducing more zones for generation charges in order to send better transmission signals, for something which happens under nodal pricing in the US. Then we also have this chapter by Paul, Otto and Joost on the EU. It's a rather ambitious chapter because he's trying to summarize what's going on with EU transmission system regulation is quite difficult. They do focus on some of the developments around the Netherlands and Germany. They widen out the discussion as Jean-Michel said. Some of them are consultants. They're very interested in emphasizing the problems in removing transmission bottlenecks which exist around supply chain shortages, the time it takes to actually deliver a transmission project within Europe. How do you finance huge expansions in investment which are big in relation to existing asset bases? And the fact that many regulatory systems are outdated across Europe, in particular with respect to expansion of networks during individual price control periods. And then, of course, just operating the system in conditions of lots of intermittent generation being added, general complexity of the European transmission system, and uncertainty that planning system will actually ever deliver individual transmission investments. So that's a really nice chapter on a sort of European level view of the transmission system. As Jean-Michel mentioned, we've got one of the sort of stars of energy economics, Paul Simshauser, who's not only manages to be a top energy economist, but also to be the CEO of a transmission company at the same time. And Paul's written a great chapter on some of the experiences of electricity networks in the national electricity market, which is in Eastern Australia. It's a case study in terms of good things to do and bad things to do. You can see there was a period of substantial overinvestment in the network in between 2007 and 2015, leading to very sharp rises in real network charges. But since then, Australia has been trying to grapple with adding huge quantities of renewables to the system. It has engaged in some innovation in terms of dealing with the connection queue of generation that wants to connect to a congested transmission system. It's introduced this first ready, first served connection model so that you can't just join the queue without having any intention really to connect, which is one of the things that's massively inflated connection queues across the world. So the Australians have implemented this new system, which actually is the process of being taken up in Great Britain, among other places. Paul also discusses the slightly complicated institutional arrangements around the NEM and brings out some of the advantages of the institutional oversight and some of the disadvantages of it. But that's definitely a chapter well worth reading. And here's a chapter that I think possibly is going to be quite timely. We thought it was important to include in the book a chapter on what engineers have to say to economists about the future. And so we asked these two distinguished power engineers to write a chapter on how the grid of the future will be different from the grid that connects fossil fuel generators to consumers. And they focused on this idea of the difference between synchronous machines and inverter-based resources. So that conventional fossil fuel generators naturally synchronize to the frequency of the grid. They adjust the amount of fuel that's pulled through the generator according to system frequency, whereas that's not the case with wind and solar resources. You need to worry about the fact that they're not synchronized. If there's grid fluctuations, they may be automatically disconnected according to algorithmic programming. And in fact, you need to have a much more sophisticated inverter, which converts your DC out of the generator into the AC current of the grid. And so they emphasize the need for these more sophisticated grid forming inverters, which naturally adjust to the grid frequency. And of course, this may or may not have been what was going on in Spain and Portugal over a couple of days ago, but certainly how you have a more stable grid with lots of wind and solar is something that engineers are concerned about, and as this chapter discusses, are working on, but it is a work in progress. Then we've got a chapter which is written by myself and colleagues looking at uncertainty. We discuss about how the path to net zero is uncertain. And the sort of uncertainty we're talking about is that a regulator planning future grid investments doesn't quite know when hydrogen is going to take off, when electric vehicles are going to take off, when new supplies and demands might come on the system. And we discuss what are the problems around that. We make a couple of interesting suggestions about the way the regulator should work. We talk about this need for a more dynamic regulation, which uses past information, current stakeholder engagement, and anticipates future changes to the system, which may come along at uncertain times, but when they come along, you're ready to deal with uptake in electric vehicles, sudden increase in hydrogen demand, or whatever. And that chapter discusses this learning regulator concept. Hydrogen, all the modeling says hydrogen is important. That's why we put a chapter in the book on hydrogen. If we're going to get to net zero, we're going to need hydrogen. And the modeling also suggests that green hydrogen will be strongly favored over other types of hydrogen. Of course, not everybody would agree with that. But the chapter discusses this, that, hydrogen produced from electricity is better way of getting to net zero than other types of hydrogen. The chapter also discusses how you would regulate a hydrogen network. The idea that they will have a separate network for hydrogen, separate from any remaining methane network. It will need to be regulated. Will it be a sort of US style open access model, or will it be more like the model that we see for network regulation of methane networks in Europe at the moment? Clearly the EU, when it's thinking about doing this, is thinking about a hydrogen network which looks and is regulated like the methane network that we have at the moment. This chapter sort of questions that. It's a really interesting chapter on what the implications of hydrogen are. Then we end up with 3 chapters on developing countries. They're really interesting. As Jean-Michel said at the beginning, increasingly electricity is not a Western product. It is increasingly going to be an Asian product. It's already true that China produces more electricity than North America plus Europe. So it's very much a Chinese commodity these days. This chapter by Zhu Yichong is a really nice chapter where she sort of points out, funnily enough, China doesn't view electricity in the same way that Western energy economists do. And it doesn't believe that in the necessity of an independent regulator. It doesn't necessarily believe in the sorts of types of regulatory systems that we see in European and countries and in North America. Of course, the result of that more controlled system where the Communist Party isn't willing to set up an independent regulatory agency is, of course, that does undermine stakeholder trust in the stability of the regulatory regime. It makes planning the network much more difficult. It makes the likelihood that the network will be under or overexpanded at some point more likely. But of course, the reason why the Communist Party is like that is because it is more worried about short-term affordability and wider social development than it is about the principles of energy economics and incentive regulation. And Zhu has written a really nice chapter where she brings home that sort of different way of looking at the world in China. India, for many years, any energy economist or any electricity economist who went to India held their head in their hands. Electricity was being given away free to a lot of consumers. State electricity board companies were making a loss. But actually, this chapter by Anupama Sen and Touraj Jamaz lays out things have actually been changing in India. And actually, India is beginning to follow a conventional path in reorganizing its electricity sector. It's done a lot of the right things over recent years. It's set up a national transmission company. It's set up a federal regulator. It's begun to experiment with running its state electricity boards better. And some of them have been restructured, privatized, and are reasonably successful, but some of them are not. As the chapter nicely points out, the intentions seem to be good, but the progress is perhaps not as rapid as it might be. But that's a really interesting chapter if you want to find out more about what's been happening in India. And then the final chapter, as Jean-Michel said, actually written by 2 people who, one of whom's still at the World Bank, and another whom Vivian, who's just left the World Bank. Vivian's recently written a book on power sector reform in developing countries. So this book, this chapter is on low and middle income countries and the variety of progress that's been made with regulation. And this chapter brings home the fact that many of the things that we take for granted in being, everybody knows about incentive regulation, and has implemented it. Well, of course, that's not true in many developing countries. But some developing countries have made reasonable progress in having reasonably well-regulated network companies and electricity companies. Colombia, for instance, Kenya's made a good job of regulating in a difficult political environment. As the chapter makes clear, However, the progress among countries generally is patchy, and as the chapter makes clear, progress which was reasonably constant before 2010 has seems to have stalled more generally. But of course, the hope in many, as the chapter discusses, in many developing countries is they're in places of the world where there's a lot of sunshine, solar is very cheap, and some of these countries have had very positive experiences with solar auctions, and there is the prospect of cheap, low carbon electricity helping to electrify these countries, and the chapter rather nicely discusses that. So thank you for listening, and happy for any comments, but these are a great set of chapters, and once again I'd want to thank the authors for writing them.
Let's go for Lucia again. Lucia, any comments, questions?
Okay, thank you. So my comments are related to the chapter written by Michael and the other authors. The one I think it's chapter 16 in the handbook, the one related to uncertainty. And the main question is addressed is how the institutional arrangement must be adapted to reshape the relationship among government, regulatory authority, and the monopolistic operator. And I think that in the new scenario of the green transition, the political side has a central role. So my first comment is related to this, the new role of the government, of the state in the regulation, because the government sets the rule of the game and the policy goal, but also it can influence, for example, the technological evolution and cost, acting through direct investment, incentives, and fiscal exemption. So I think that today the regulation of economic activity is deeply influenced by the political process. And not only for the ideological priority, but also for example, intergovernmental dynamics. Think, for example, the relationship among the European Union, the member states, and the local governments inside the state. So what I think is that regulation at the end is not just a technical matter. So it's a reflection of political choices, power dynamics, and societal values. So we are used to underline the independence of regulation from the government. But in the future, looking ahead, we have ambitious decarbonization goals. So maybe we need more cooperation. How much state, how much market we have to introduce in the new regulation. So, for example, also the trade-off between efficiency and fair distribution. This, I think, is a second important point on which political side and regulators must share their responsibility. And finally, coming to the third side of the triangle, let's say, so thinking about the monopolistic company in charge of transmission and distribution, I think, for example, that year 2022 has been a sort of turning point for regulation. For example, in UK, we observed dozens of suppliers collapsing after the soaring of energy prices. So the government has to intervene and to introduce new provisions, like, for example, the suppliers of last resort, and maybe to this all call for a reform of Ofgem objective, shifting, for example, from competition and efficiency issues to promoting resilience and consumer protection. So I think that we have a challenge from this point of view, or reshaping the relationship among the three parties of regulation. And I would like to ask Michael a comment about this. Thank you.
At least we have a challenge from Lucia, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Lucia. Obviously, I've written loads of papers about this, which I commend to you. But let me just focus on what's in the book, because you raised something right at the beginning, which I do, which is very important, which is something that we do discuss in the book, which is about where does regulation sit within the general governance of the electricity system. So what we discuss in the book is, that there should at least be a tripartite regulation of the electricity system. So we discuss, the idea that there's the system operator, there's the regulator, and there's the government department. And absolutely, what you're highlighting are issues which can only be dealt with by the government department. And I think we went through a period, didn't we, of benign, in the 2000s, maybe early 2000s, we went through a period where people seriously thought we can get rid of the energy ministry and we can just leave it to the energy regulator. And the energy regulator can be at arm's length from the government. And, the government can, in a sense, shut down the energy department, Of course, what we've discovered is that is just not going to work, because we're in a world where we need to put lots of subsidies into the energy system. Those can only be signed off by the government, because they're essentially taxes, even though they might be being paid through electricity bills. And similarly, and through the crisis, we big time, no regulator could handle that on its own. So one of the things we discuss in the book is, regulators need to do their job within this tripartite system. They won't be able to solve or deliver net zero on their own, because that requires big government decisions to support it. But, and I think a standard mistake that regulators can make is to take on too much from the government and then be politically vulnerable when the government changes. So yeah, that's something we very much discuss in there. The other thing that we do also discuss is whether you need to reorganize the assets, and that actually, to reduce uncertainty, you might need some asset reorganization. And that, that should be thought about. Why would you have the gas and the electricity networks in different companies when actually it might pay you to put them in the same company to jointly decarbonize them? So absolutely agree with you that the regulator can't do everything. And it's the relationship between the regulator, the system operator, and the government that matters.
And Michael Pollitt will be there in 2050. So he will have to answer on the final response. While in 2050, like Paul, I will do something else in another planet, maybe on Mars. Why not Mars? Now we're going to Chloe. Chloe, comments, questions?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Michael. It was a really impressive overview. Make us wanted to read the book. So obviously the governance issue it's a big one. So you already discussed with Lucia, so I'm not going to touch upon. I was just curious, just to take UK. So UK is really one of the leader right now in terms of reforming and trying some regulation. So I wanted to hear from you, because I think the UK example is interesting also because there's all this development of platform, right? So where you try to coordinate flexibility and then so you try really to, and I was just curious to know, okay, to hear from you. Okay, so you have those platforms, some are competitive also, and then where is the regulation there? Should you leave, or should you have the regulation really precise, or should you keep it as a typically competition policy framework? So that would be my first question that I would like to comment on or to answer. The second point is also and maybe I haven't read the book, but there's this also big issue of demand response, and then it would be interesting to from the case, maybe from different country, what's going on? Is there any innovative way to address this issue in terms of regulation? Because so with Paul, we were talking about incentive regulation. So can we also make sure that we have some demand response here? And when we talk about regulation and governance, so that would be my second point. And finally, just you know, you say, okay, we need another regulation for hydrogen, like we have methane, and then so how many regulation do we need? Do we need for each new technology? And then, hey, who is going to handle all those regulation, and who is going to monitor? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chloe. Nice to see you. Okay, let me so taking one at a time. The sort of procurement of services by the distribution company. I think what you're talking about there is like constraint management purchasing. So the distribution company has got the choice to either upgrade the network and create more capacity, or it could just manage the peak use of the network with some constraint management. It could pay some demand to turn down at the peak time rather than exceed the capacity of the network, or it could pay a battery to turn up if there's an export constraint from embedded generation. That's been reasonably successful in the UK. I mean, the reason why, okay, because this is where the things they don't tell you is that where this has come from is TOTEX regulation. So this is, why do distribution companies in the UK do this? Well, it's because I could either upgrade the line and conventional capital solution, or I could engage in this OPEX expenditure where I pay somebody to constraint manage for me. And so actually this has all been incentivized by TOTEX regulation. So, in that sense, it's a really good thing. And it is benchmarked against the external cost of in a sense, the backstop cost of the network expansion. So your question about, well, what's the most we would pay for this? I think, having worked on this for years and far too many years, there's a lot of, there are question marks about how competitive some of the offers actually are. That's true, but they are cheaper than the capital alternative. So that's, I think, the first thing to say. And I think Claude does discuss this a little bit in her chapter. On the demand response, well, we've got the chapter by Faruqi. So of course the bottom line across the world on demand response is, if you've got really high electricity prices, you get more demand response. If you suppress electricity prices, well, hey, you don't. And also, if you've got retail markets, you're more likely to get innovative demand response than if you don't. So some of the recent experience in the UK was in the crisis. In the crisis, prices were high enough where some retailers began to offer, innovative pricing, where they say, if you turn down in this hour, we'll send you an alert day ahead, turn down in this hour, and we will pay you 10 times your normal price for every deemed reduction relative to your normal consumption. I always tell the story now of my mum, who tells me very proudly, she's with Octopus Energy, she says, electricity was free between 8 and 9 a.m. last Sunday, and I baked you, some scones. I turned everything on. But, this is my mum who's 90. So, yeah, she's understanding the retail offer, and she's saving a few. I tell her, Mum, you've probably saved about 50p, But she did make the scones, so it was great. So, it's all about price, isn't it, in terms of demand response, and about some innovation around that, people aren't responding to 5p cheaper, they're responding to it's free for that period. So there are some innovative things happening, but, it's all dependent on how high the price is. On the hydrogen methane thing, I think that, obviously, the chapter is really interesting because I agree with Kong because he's an old colleague of mine. He makes, a number of basic points. I think the modeling suggests you wouldn't have a joint hydrogen. You're never going to mix. In net zero, you won't be mixing hydrogen and methane. You'll have a hydrogen network. Maybe you'll be mixing biomethane and hydrogen, maybe, if you got enough biomethane. So he says, well, you'll have a hydrogen network. The question is, how would you regulate it? The default regulation is the way we regulate networks at the moment, is his argument. Of course, we may not have, in response to your point, will we just have another network to regulate? Well, we might not have the methane network. Okay. And so what if we have another network to regulate? I mean, some regulators are already doing heat networks. Some energy regulators also regulate aspects of gasoline regulation. So I'm not sure that's, I don't think having another network to regulate is a big deal. But I think there are very interesting questions about, should you treat it the same way as an existing network, or think of it as being, this is more like the cable network. It's competing with the conventional technology. We're not going to regulate it at all. Might be one approach.
I guess we have to go to the general audience now. We have 3 questions asked in the Q&A box. The first one is obviously for both of you, Paul and Michael. Very simple one, but very interesting always. Grid fees. Why not to differentiate grid fees for owners of PV rooftop and the others? Why? Why not, Paul? And it has been discussed in your country so many times.
Well, I think there are maybe good arguments for differentiating grid fees, but you first have to make sure you've unbundled grid fees from the rest of the bundle of services that are being offered. And I think time differentiated grid fees and that may affect different kinds of end-use services differently. Are going to become more important as a way of conserving grid resources, basically. I know here in Massachusetts, the 2 major distribution utilities have proposed billions and billions of dollars of grid enhancements to meet forecasts, I think imaginary forecasts of EV penetration and rooftop PV penetration and electric heat pump penetration. And the answer is, the question is there some way we can use prices to conserve on the demand for grid services? And the answer is yes, that we can have time differentiated grid fees so that people don't all come back home from work at 6 p.m. and plug their cars in and put a lot of strain on the grid. And this is a level of sophistication for residential and small commercial customers that is only just getting talked about in the U.S.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Paul said. I mean,
do you have any sun in Great Britain or only rain and wind?
No, our solar panels are doing well today. I mean, the point that Paul is the point that's very important is, why should people who are exporting solar get a rebate on grid fees? Because that's essentially what's happening. You're getting your grid paid back, your fee paid back per unit. So the debate is, the debate has been about whether more of the grid fee should be a fixed per day charge or a size of connection based charge rather than a per unit utilization charge. So there's definitely a debate to be had around that. Of course, that's not obvious, because if people have electric vehicles as well, and EVs are paying the full grid cost per kilowatt hour, of course, then it depends whether you have an EV or a PV based system, as to whether actually as people use more, charge up their EVs more at home, they're actually reducing the grid fees for everybody else. So, so actually, it's not clear cut as to the fixed versus variable.
It was from Adurim and Mirella. Now from Floris, but it's I assume mainly Michael. What's about the overinvestment in Queensland? How do you explain it? Is it only Queensland or also other part of Australia or the world?
Well, I think read the chapter. I think it's other parts of the NEM. They had this big network expansion in over this period where they were just expanding the capacity of the network, and it wasn't clear whether this was entirely necessary or not. And that just shows you that regulators need to do their job in not just approving more and more expenditure on the network, because this goes straight through to people's bills. I was interested in looking at Paul's bill. I mean, how much the grid charges had gone up per kilowatt hour. That was the job of the regulator to control that. And what they saw in Queensland was a really significant rise in per kilowatt hour grid charges in the short space of time.
And Paul, anything of this kind in the US, or rather the opposite? Grids are not responding enough.
I think they're not responding enough. I have a paper with some of my colleagues coming out in the Economic Journal where we actually look at the impacts on EV charging decisions of putting on kilowatt-based grid charges that actually could vary by time of day. And it's kind of easy for EVs because at least at the residential level, and to some extent even more so at the commercial level, you don't want everyone going on the grid at the same time to charge their vehicles, because that just really strains the grids. They weren't built for it. On the other hand, with smart chargers, there's no reason why you couldn't program them to just charge overnight while you're sleeping, or depending on how smart it is, where you put in, how many miles I'm going to drive in the next 2 days, and when I'm leaving for work or going out to take my kids to school, and you let that optimize when you're charging based on minimizing the cost impact on the grid. And I think that's a level of sophistication and rate design for smaller residential and commercial customers that has not gained traction yet in the U.S. For very large customers, not necessarily as large as data centers, so they have to pay for grid extensions above a certain capacity, and I think they're much more sensitive to trying to minimize those costs and spread out their loads on the system, including using on-site storage and some on-site generation to spread out their peaks on the system to control costs. These days, grid expansions at the distribution level are very expensive because increasingly people want them underground. I mean, I live in a part of Boston, it's all above ground. And when they've come in and said, everyone's buying EVs, we're going to have to upgrade your distribution system, all of my neighbors say, fine, let's put it underground. And that's 7 times more expensive. So it becomes a much more significant consideration than has been the case for the last 70 years, basically.
Now, again, on Australia, but in fact, we can apply it in any country. Should we replace first come, first serve regarding connection to the grid, or first ready, first serve, or literally to auction off any transmission access? What do you think appropriate? Boom, boom. Paul? Paul again?
This is kind of a long story, but I think first of all, at least in the US context, the system operators ought to be thinking out into the future as to where it's likely that new wind and solar facilities are going to be connected to the network, and basically pre-build these systems. It takes long to plan, permit, and construct interconnections, and then to publish where connections can be accommodated easily and where they're going to be increased costs. In the US, the generator, the wind or solar or battery facility, needs to pay for the interconnection costs, but they have very bad information. So they just get on all the lines. And it's a very bad system. That's why you get the queues. So I think some combination of better information as to where it's hard and where it's going to be easy, combined with I like the Justin ready first kind of approach. There is a bit of a chicken and egg problem here, because the way these work now is the developers get online, they then go and look for a PPA, they then get a PPA, then they try to get financing. The financing people then say, okay, you've got a PPA, but you don't have an interconnection agreement. And we're not going to commit to financing until you have an interconnection agreement, but you can't get an interconnection agreement until you can put up the money for the interconnection. So I think it helps to have well-defined areas where connection is easy, and where the costs are already well known, and also to charge people, whether it's directly or through an auction, to get online, because now you want to develop a project somewhere, you get on five different lines, and then it turns out 20% ever get built, because actually the real capacity is 20% of what of the nominal capacity that's in the queues. And there's some evidence when you increase the costs of getting online that the number online declines dramatically, and there's self-selection to, gee, I'm going to stick with the one that's where I'm going to get to the end of the line.
I have to stop you, Paul, because I need something from Michael, and I will have to conclude. Michael.
Absolutely, Paul's absolutely right. I mean, just to say what the situation in the UK is, the queue was closed at the point where it was more than 3 times the 2050 requirement for net zero. So, clearly most of these things were never going to get connected. So absolutely yes, first come, first ready, or first ready, first served is a good place to start. And as Paul's chapter actually suggests what Paul has just said, which is, make capacity available, then just start connecting people of the same type when they're ready to connect. And that being ready costs several $1 million per project, so it's a serious investment in the Australian case. Just to say, the one wrinkle which I have worked on is, of course, you don't necessarily want it to be just about money, because when you've got data center versus housing development, it's not clear you always want the highest bidder to win in the auction. So what the Spaniards have done for one of their connection auctions is actually had a scoring system which was based on other criteria than just the value of the connection, but some of the social and environmental criteria. So you can have a more sophisticated assessment process for available capacity, which of course makes a lot of sense, especially as you go down to lower voltages. So you're just not connecting data centers first every time. You're also thinking about investments that have social value.
I have to close there, Michael. We have another question from Nicolo Rossetto. Nicolo will get a private answer, because Nicolo is also the organizer of the next online, the 4th of June, where we will tackle European Union regulation, past and future. And remember that if you want to meet us face to face, to drink a coffee, etc., It is the 17th of June in Paris, including if you have project, events, you want to organize something with the authors of the book. I will consider any offer you will do in any country. I can repeat, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, India, Brazil, South Africa, etc. I have to close. It's a pain for me because I literally love what we do. I would have to repeat only one thing. No country, no block of countries will decide the future of electricity, energy, and regulation. It's a collective duty of humanity. We will do it differently as long as we do it with sincere approach. I know that we have different constraints, different resources, different willingness. As long as we are sincere, it does not matter if we do differently. What is very important is to do something to tackle the challenge. That's it. I will, of course, thank my friends, Chloe and Lucia, the discussants, Paul and Michael, the speakers, and Tomiris, because without a dedicated and very smart organizer, nothing can work. You have seen how miserable it was with my slide. So Tomiris is the goddess making things happen at Forum School. Excellent end of the day to all of us and excellent day for the Americans. Ciao, ciao tutti.